Now we're going to focus on the Ric Flair documentary that's launched on Monday up on Peacock. And I don't believe there's a regular means to find this in Canada. So you have to get your flashlight out and search it out. But sometimes these things fall in our lap and we are able to watch it. But this was, heavily hyped by Ric Flair. He had talked about this is the best documentary on his career, took his shots over the years at the ESPN 30 for 30 special that Rory Karp put together that I thought was like a fairly strong piece on Ric Flair from a couple of years back. And this one, I mean, I will say this felt like a WWE DVD release or a network special that they would put on there. And I guess, we should start to me with what was the biggest question was how you handle the controversy about Ric Flair that stemmed from Dark Side of the Ring involving Heidi Doyle, the flight attendant. And their answer was to not address it at all. And I thought that really hurt the credibility of this documentary, that it was not referred to. And at most, you can say in passing, Flair said, "I've made mistakes in my life, but I never did anything to intentionally hurt anyone." Yeah. That's as much as something that you have to really bend over backwards to read into.
Yeah. The fact that this was on Peacock, the fact that this was a WWE production with Kevin Dunn as an executive producer and, several of even WWE DVD archival footage and matches, of course, being used on this was probably enough to tell me that it wasn't going to get into any sort of controversial area. But
the Teddy Hart one had all those things going for it.
Yeah, I suppose so. That almost feels like a bit of an outlier that they never referenced. But anyway, just the Flair thing, I wouldn't have expected it knowing the circumstances around its production. However, you had Ric Flair himself do interviews prior to this documentary's release talking about how we will get his response to the plane ride from hell. I might even dig up some specific quotes, but it was Flair himself who promised that this documentary would address that controversy from his perspective, and we got none of it. So that was very disappointing. And in terms of
I thought it was glaring to the point that I think it diminishes. I'm not saying this whole thing has to be built around that the whole documentary has to cover this, but to ignore it completely, that Dark Side of the Ring episode came out. And, he had his response denying it, and everyone is due their side of the story. This was Ric Flair's chance to have his side out there. And by ignoring it completely, you almost hand over the ability for your audience to make its own conclusions. You have given them that ability to do so by not addressing it at all. I think it is just as bad as, covering it, and it comes off poorly. I just think that I also go into this understanding that there are a large amount of people that are fixated on these figures from their childhood, and that's what they want. They want their childhood heroes, and they don't want to hear about the dirty secrets or controversies. They want to live vicariously through their childhood heroes, and many people will overlook issues that exist that are out there. But I think not to handle this, not to speak about, not to even defend himself in any of this, whether that was pressure from those around him that say, hey, this thing's died over. Why are we going to put it back into the public? We don't want to cover this. There could have been people, whoever it is, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, it's Ric Flair's presentation. It's his documentary, and it falls on him that I just thought you can look at this and the different interviews, and there's some heart-wrenching stories, especially about his son, that you feel awful that this individual has gone through. But this really hurt the documentary to me that it was not even addressed.
So this comes to us from 411 Mania, their transcript, but it is a quote from his To Be the Man podcast for ad-free shows. Again, transcript courtesy of Fightful via 411 Mania. He says, one of the most difficult things I've ever been through in my life personally, aside from health issues, is having 85,000 people tell me within 2 minutes that I wasn't on the opening of Raw or SmackDown after, talking about the opening
the signature.
After that bullshit from Plane Ride from Hell came out, which is all bullshit. It is explained thoroughly in my new documentary. I mean, thoroughly. I'm calling some people out big time. If they had left me off, I wouldn't mind it because I had my time and it's not my time anymore. But it is something that means a lot to me personally, as it does to everyone else. I'm sure they would tell you that if they were being honest with you, it is a big deal. You're seen worldwide 3 times a week. Okay, he's just talking about how hurt he is from being left out of the signature.
So it obviously wasn't his call. And obviously, it was addressed and it was pulled. And you can jump to conclude. At the end of the day, though, I think it reflects most poorly on Ric Flair that it's not in there, whether he had a say on it or not. And that really does tell you something, like your documentary and how little, like if that meant that much to you and it's pulled, tells me you have no control over this documentary.
So from my perspective, John, I'm going in expecting this. Like, this is almost like the main nugget of like gold we're searching for at the center of this entire documentary.
It's what I wrote about on Monday in my update. It was like that was the key of the documentary of how that would be handled.
Instead, we got really kind of a look at what this man is and how he has an, you know, he can't turn off being the character is essentially what this documentary is telling us. He can't turn off being the partying, womanizing character who gets what he wants. Think about how bad that sounds, you know, in the context of me searching for an answer, his answer to the plane ride from hell story. You know, this unfortunately only bolsters my impression of the guy that I got from the plane ride from hell episode. You know, the idea that this is a man who would probably drink a whole lot more than he should, loves to womanize, and, you know, loves to prove people wrong when they tell him no. So yeah, I thought it was pretty bad from that aspect.
Yeah, and you try to figure, like, it's very complicated when WWE is involved with this, and here they took action after that plane ride from hell episode, taking his image out of the opening signature, and it's like WWE like responded, like they had action that they took from that, and then quietly put it back in, and it was quietly
it's what
restored.
Vince was expecting that how he was going to navigate all this. With enough time, people were going to forget about it. It's how they got away. Hogan, you know, essentially gets away with the same thing. So
yeah. So I'm just left with a lot of questions, and I don't like guessing on this kind of stuff, but that's what they kind of leave you with here, of like why this was left out, whether this was a WWE call, whether this was a Peacock call. Based on that quote, it certainly doesn't seem like a Ric Flair call, but how much had he given up here? Like it's the tricky part about these kinds of documentaries is that we sometimes see in the opposite side that for a lot of these major figures that do these documentaries, it's through their production companies and